mansion.
In the 1950s, Dr. Seuss had gone Hollywood.
This is my day.
With multiple Academy Awards and a reputation for making hit
They can still make trouble.
after hit. The Good Doctor seemed just about unstoppable.
What's that? Cried his father, his face turning gray. That's a very odd thing for a young boy to say.
That's when he decided to go big, releasing his darkest, wildest, and most pointed political satire to date.
The years you spend with Dr. Terwilliger will be the happiest years of your life.
And the 5,000 Fingers of Dr. T turned out to be such a disaster that the industry buried it for decades.
This was the dream of dreams which fell very short.
But it's this epic failure and the heartbreak that comes after that all leads to the creation of one of our most iconic characters.
Are you prepared? Let me see your fingers, lad. Are they limber? Are they happy?
Now, if you saw my last video, you already know how young Ted Geisel, also known as Dr. Seuss, started his career in advertising.
Your writing name is Dr. Seuss. Why did you pick that particular name? Any particular reason?
It's a complete phony. That's my middle name, and I put the doctor in front of it.
His success there led him to a life as a political cartoonist, all before working with the U.S. military on top-secret animated shorts.
So, gentlemen, if you want to fool them, remember this. Just make yourself part of the natural surroundings. See what I mean?
And how, while working with Hollywood legends like Frank Capra, Chuck Jones, and even a young Stan Lee, Dr. Seuss began to develop a love for filmmaking. But at the time, not even the brilliant but self-proclaimed doctor could have imagined just how bad things were about to get. And how, out of all of the scorched earth and reflection that lay ahead, the legacy of Dr. Seuss would end up being forged.
Arrest this man! Take him to the castle!
The crazy thing is just how fast Dr. Seuss hit the ground running in Hollywood. To say that he found almost instantaneous success would be putting it lightly. Before joining the army, Seuss had agreed to write an adaptation of his second children's book, The 500 Hats of Bartholomew Cubbins. The stop-motion short was released in 1943 and was well received, earning an Academy Award nomination for Best Animated Short Film.
Please, mister. The king says you should chop off my hair.
Paramount was so pleased with the collaboration that they did it again the following year, bringing on Seuss to adapt his first children's book, And to Think That I Saw It on Mulberry Street. Once again, the result was a huge success, managing to snag yet another nomination for Best Animated Short Film at the 1945 Academy Awards.
Oh boy, what a pace! And they're dumping confetti all over the place.
By this point, Dr. Seuss was knee-deep working for the Army's motion picture unit. With World War II winding down, the United States military shifted towards occupying Germany and Japan. And so with how successful Private Snafu had been in training adults in the field, Frank Capra once again turned to Dr. Seuss to write 2 final top-secret films. But before we continue, I've got to tell you about today's sponsor, Factor, and how they've been continuing to help me stay on top of my goals. Believe it or not, the holidays are almost over. And if you're like me, that's when you curl up into a ball and enter recovery mode for a while. So when it's time to eat, you think I got time to spend prepping, planning, and worrying about calorie counting or protein intake or what I'm snacking on? No, that's where Factor comes in. Forget about delivery. Factor's got over 35 meals to choose from each and every week that are chef-crafted, dietitian approved, and get delivered right to your door. They're fresh, never frozen, and ready to heat and eat in just 2 minutes. With options for keto, calorie smart, vegan plus veggie, and so much more. Which means you'll have that much more quality time to catch the Lion King movie in theaters. Now, pass. So head over to factor75.com or click on the link below and use code 50OtherVault to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first Factor box. That's code 50OtherVault at factor75.com to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first box. Big thanks to Factor for sponsoring the video. Now back to Dr. Seuss. The first of these was 1945's Your Job in Germany. Written by Seuss and directed by Capra, the goal was simple: to remind soldiers that even though the German people were no longer the enemy, they still shouldn't be trusted.
The next war. That is why you occupy Germany. To make that next war impossible.
Seuss's other top-secret film was released that same year.
The end of the war. The beginning of another peace. Peace, if we can solve the problem of 70 million Japanese people.
Our Job in Japan's intention was to train troops for the work that the US military was doing as the Pacific Theater was winding down.
Dirty, stinking, heartbreaking years of it. All because of one idea that was sold to the Japanese brain. That same brain today remains the problem. Our problem.
Even at the time, these were both very dramatic propaganda films that were focused more on hammering home points rather than being factually accurate.
You will not be friendly. You will be aloof, watchful.
And while Your Job in Germany and Our Job in Japan were never meant for the public, Hollywood still found a way to profit off of both of them. Warner Brothers secured the rights to Your Job in Germany soon after its completion. In less than a year, the studio had rewritten, re-edited, and re-released it into theaters as Hitler Lives. This would go on to win a 1946 Academy Award for Best Documentary Short.
And the United States of America. We almost lost this one. It took everything we had.
Less than 2 years later, RKO would release an updated version of Our Job in Japan, titled Design for Death. Though, unlike what had been done with Hitler Lives, RKO hired both Dr. Seuss and his wife to expand the short into a feature-length documentary. And this too would go on to win an Oscar for Best Documentary Feature for 1947.
We're sticking around until they've shown us, convinced us, that they've got themselves under control.
If this wasn't enough of a hot streak, a writer that had worked with Seuss on Private Snafu pulled him in to develop another animated short. This ended up being 1950's Gerald McBoing Boing, which also ended up winning an Academy Award in 1951 for Best Animated Short.
From Public School 7 to Mrs. McCloy, your little son Gerald's a most hopeless boy. We cannot accept him, for we have a rule that pupils must not go in our school.
In just the span of about 8 years, Dr. Seuss's projects had gotten 4 Academy Award nominations with 2 wins. At this point, the big screen seemed like nothing short of destiny. But these good times wouldn't last long. Dr. Seuss was about to cash in his chips to make his newest and most wonderful big-budget Seussian spectacular. The 5,000 Fingers of Dr. T would put his off-kilter imagination on full display. It would be his grand unveiling to Hollywood and audiences all around the world. And it would bomb so spectacularly that Dr. Seuss refused to work on a feature-length film ever again.
Attention! Attention everyone in the Terwilliger Institute. Down below me, joyful and eager, my students are awaiting our date with destiny.
On the surface, the 5,000 Fingers of Dr. T seemed like a pretty simple fantasy musical. A young kid named Bart is being forced by his widowed mother to take piano lessons, which he absolutely hates, mainly because of his tyrannical teacher, Dr. Terwilliger.
1 month before I present all my pupils in a grand concert. And I'm not going to let one dreary little boy humiliate me, do you understand?
Bart falls asleep while practicing and dreams himself into a fantastical world. A world where Dr. Terwilliger has become a literal tyrant, complete with an evil plan.
Tomorrow, down below me, I will have 500 little boys, 5,000 little fingers.
Dr. T isn't the only familiar face, though. We've also got Bart's mother, who's been brainwashed into helping the whole operation. She's also being forced to marry Terwilliger as part of his overall scheme.
Mom!
Mrs.
Collins, why are you standing there with that null and void expression? I know the workings of your mind, Mrs. Collins. You've been thinking of your son again. How many times must I tell you to burn that picture?
Then there's Mr. Zabludowski, the plumber we see at the beginning of the film. With Bart's mother so checked out, he becomes the parental figure. Though this being a Dr. Seuss story, the adult in the room rarely has any of the answers that anyone is looking for.
But you're my only hope.
Well, just give up hope right here and now.
Now, one of the wildest things about this picture is just how many different themes Dr. Seuss jammed into it. The fatherless Bart feels like Dr. T has hypnotized his mother and is trying to marry her. And so to counter this, Bart tries to convince Mr. Zabludowski to marry his mom instead.
Boy, I'd hate to have you for a father.
Just what makes you think I'd want to be your father?
We also get a brief mention of the incoming atomic age, along with the real-life anxiety that was felt at the time.
Is it atomic?
Yes, sir. Very atomic.
Atomic?
There's the theme of anti-authority that we see in much of Seuss's later work. This was especially counterculture in the 1950s, where young baby boomers were eager to instill family roles using the Dick and Jane series, or countless educational films.
You've seen the girl who always has to win an argument. Most of the time she behaves like a young lady, but let someone disagree with her, well, she might just as well be 5 years old.
But in the 5,000 Fingers of Dr. T, Seuss goes beyond any old anti-authority message and offers up his biggest and most direct satire yet. Because in this world of musical fantasy, Dr. Terwilliger is a complete and total authoritarian. At the Terwilliger Institute, the piano is the supreme instrument. Anyone who has the misfortune of practicing anything else is imprisoned in the dungeon.
Pretty soon there'll be no musicians left in this world excepting for them what play the piano.
And even if you are a piano player, it's important that you're an obedient disciple because
Practice makes perfect. Practice makes perfect.
Dr. T's whole plan is completely off the wall. It involves bussing in unsuspecting kids and then stripping them of their possessions, all to create an army of 500 piano-playing children.
Every finger obedient to the whim of me, the master.
And even when Zabludowski confronts Dr. T about his scheme,
I've heard rumors about your operation.
Rumors? Scuttlebutt. I can tell you all about the rumors. The rumors of corruption that breeds in high places. Rumors seeking to discredit my noble aim.
You talk a lot, but I don't know how much you say.
he ends up getting completely gaslit into believing that maybe it isn't such a bad operation after all.
There isn't anything at all to these silly old rumors. The sole purpose of our endeavor is the musical betterment of American youth.
You know, the way you put it, it doesn't sound so bad.
All before he's showered with the finest cigars, fanciest foods, and top-shelf booze.
For such a distinguished guest, the pride of our cellars. Vintage pickle juice.
Though throughout the film, it's the strange and unusual stylings of Dr. Seuss that's the real star of the show. The sets, the costumes, the dialogue, it's all dripping with Seussian style. There are just so many moments that look like they could have come right off of his sketch pad. And this all makes sense. Producer Stanley Kramer, who had served with Seuss in the Army Motion Picture Unit, encouraged him to let his imagination run wild. Though this freedom may not have been the best idea. The initial draft came in at over 1,200 pages and envisioned even bigger sets, more musical numbers, and around 500 children for the final scene. Also not helping things was that Kramer wasn't exactly on good terms with the head of Columbia Pictures. Endless interference and countless pages of notes left the production in a constant state of frustration. But this was all just the tip of the iceberg, because it was the final act and eventual release of the 5,000 Fingers of Dr. T that would have Dr. Seuss swearing to never work in Hollywood again.
To put together Eugene Loring, the dance director, and Frederick Hollander for music, and Dr. Seuss, Ted Geisel, who designed this film, and to do it in Technicolor and do a fantasy, which is what they say closes on Saturday night like a satire. We tried it, and it didn't come off.
Do you think that the public took it too seriously? And people like myself, I went to see it, and various others?
They took it seriously, all right.
As the film was nearing completion, the studio screened a preview for a test audience. To say it wasn't well received would be putting it lightly. The story was too bizarre, the characters too cartoonish, the music was all over the place, and most of all, it just felt too dark for families.
My man is inside the drum.
Rather than work with Seuss and the crew to come up with creative solutions, Columbia took a chainsaw to the film. Cuts to everything from musical numbers and entire scenes were demanded. A brand new opening scene was created during a full week of reshoots. Did this heavy-handed studio interference help with the final film? Of course not. When the 5,000 Fingers of Dr. T did eventually premiere in July of 1953, the film was absolutely savaged by critics, who called it strange and confusing. Audiences largely stayed away too, leading to it only making back $250,000 of its $2.75 million budget.
It grossed, incidentally, minus $6.
And while it was nominated for Best Musical Score at the Academy Awards, this wouldn't stop Dr. T from becoming an inside joke told throughout Hollywood for decades. The worst critic of all was none other than Dr. Seuss, who called the film a debaculous fiasco. Hollywood is not suited for me, and I am not suited for it. But little did the good doctor know at the time just how wild of a roller coaster ride his life was about to become. Towards the end of those long hours and dark days working on Dr. T, Seuss had a light bulb moment, and it wasn't just that his dream of Hollywood didn't match reality. Through all of this drafting, editing, and rewriting, Dr. Seuss realized that the older audience of the 1950s just wasn't that much fun to write for. In a 1952 piece published in the New York Times, he would go on to criticize adults for having lost their sense of humor, that their laughter had been conditioned around political, racial, religious, and societal norms, and that this laughter was often targeted towards members of society who were often feared, despised, or seen as inferior. He writes, "In the same way, you were supposed to guffaw when someone told a story which proved that Swedes are stupid, Scots are tight, Englishmen are stuffy, and the Mexicans never wash." This was a turning point because it accurately describes Seuss's work from a decade earlier. His reflections on writing, intentions, and audiences led to some serious soul-searching, particularly about the vicious way he had depicted the Japanese in his political cartoons. And so, hot on the heels of one of his biggest creative disasters landing in theaters, Dr. Seuss set sail for Japan, and it's here that the children of the people he once vilified showed a different side of their story.
And so the Japanese storyteller reaches the exciting climax of his fairy tale. His young listeners have forgotten that they are living on a street in Kyoto, Japan. They are far away in a magic land which is visited by children of all countries.
With the help of Life magazine, Dr. Seuss spent 6 weeks on assignment traveling throughout Kyoto, Osaka, and Kobe. The goal of this trip? It depended on who you asked. For Life, this was a great story to publish. A well-known propagandist turned author confronts the very people he had once targeted. The hook being that the experiences shared would be in the form of artwork from more than 1,000 children. For Seuss, he was enthusiastic about all of this as part of his journey of reflection. But also, his wife Helen had always dreamed of traveling to Japan, and taking this assignment meant that the trip would be covered almost entirely by the magazine. None of that mattered once Seuss began talking with teachers and students and analyzing more than 15,000 children's drawings. Drawings of heartbreak, of factory work, of traditionalism. But what made the biggest impact was just how forward-thinking and hopeful so much of this artwork was. World War II and its horrors hadn't stopped these children from dreaming of becoming the next wave of scientists, or Olympic baseball players, or space explorers. Most had visions of themselves working for a better world. And it was this experience and introspection that compelled Dr. Seuss to write Horton Hears a Who when he returned. Released in 1954, the story focuses on an elephant who discovers a seemingly insignificant speck of dust. This speck is really the small planet of Whoville, but despite his insistence that
a person's a person,
no matter how small.
Others around him don't recognize the Who's as equals, or that they even exist, until they hear it through the voice of a child.
Yeah.
This was clearly one of Seuss's most personal books, one that he even dedicated to his translator and guide who accompanied him throughout his journey through Japan. After the success of Horton Hears a Who, and the even bigger Cat in the Hat just 3 years later, Dr. Seuss once again examined his complicated relationship with Whoville. In the 3 years between these books, Ted's wife Helen had contracted Guillain-Barré syndrome, a neurological disease that left her paralyzed from the neck down. She would slowly recover, but Dr. Seuss would have a much more difficult time shaking the grief and grouchiness he felt throughout this whole experience, especially when it came to the holidays. And it was these complicated feelings and his general distaste for commercialism that would form the basis for the Grinch. I did this nasty, anti-Christmas character that was really myself. Back in their role as a reflective foil were the good-natured Who's of Whoville, but in this story, they were no longer dependent on the main character to save them. In How the Grinch Stole Christmas, it's the Who's that are doing the saving.
In Whoville, they say that the Grinch's small heart grew 3 sizes that day.
The Grinch would go on to become arguably Dr. Seuss's biggest character, in large part thanks to the 1966 TV special broadcast almost a decade after the book. This special reunited Seuss with Chuck Jones and rekindled much of the magic felt on the production of Private Snafu. This collaboration would continue with a similar TV special for Horton Hears a Who. This time, though, Dr. Seuss would bring in Dr. Terwilliger himself, Hans Conried, as the narrator.
He was splashing, enjoying the jungle's great joys, when Horton the elephant heard a small noise.
And these early collaborations gave Seuss the confidence to keep going in the television format. Before too long, Cat in the Hat got its own special too, and The Grinch got a prequel and even a crossover, both of which ended up winning Primetime Emmy Awards. Sure, the lights overhead weren't as bright, the carpet under his feet wasn't exactly red, and while he had become slightly older and more Grinchy over the years, Dr. Seuss finally felt that he was right where he wanted to be. This is actually part 2 of my deep dive into the early days of Dr. Seuss. Make sure to check out part 1 to see the wild top secret cartoons that he made for the US military.